One of my goals for this year was to improve my home gardening skills. For many years we were living in more of an apartment in an urban environment, but we finally settled on our long-term home that we hope to stay at for a while. And so now we have a little bit more space to do some gardening. Gardening is a very important prepper skill set. It's very common with homesteaders, for example, and it's one that I really wanted to improve upon. For a few years now, all I really had was an herb garden, so growing things like basil and cilantro and parsley and things like that. That was fairly easy for me to do, and I did it in more of a container garden format. This is something that could be easily done even in an urban environment. You could put it out on your window, for example, or if you have a porch at your apartment, you could set up a small herb garden. Since moving to our home, my wife has gotten really into gardening. She loves growing roses and she has rose gardens all throughout the backyard. But for me as a prepper, I really wanted my garden to be filled with things that I could actually eat. And if I couldn't eat it, then I wanted it to be something that would help the items that I would want to eat. So for pollinators to bring in some of the nice bees and things like that to help my garden grow. Well, earlier this year, I conducted a Preppers Gardening Roundtable where I invited several preppers who are very established gardeners, and we had a roundtable discussion on the live stream, link in the description box. I had a blast on that particular live stream. We did a second one, and it really motivated me to go all in on gardening. Now, in hindsight, I did start a little late in the growing season, but I didn't care. I just wanted to go all in with it as best as possible. So I wasn't really expecting much. Since the majority of the people that watch this channel are urban preppers, I wanted to focus on something that could be done in an urban environment. So I gravitated towards container gardening. So going with a lot of different containers, I really like this for multiple reasons. With container gardening, I thought it'd be a little bit more portable, so I could move pots around if need be. If you had a deck, you could switch it to different spots depending on where the sunlight is. And in the rare case that you actually had to move to a different home, you could bring your garden with you. So in year one of my gardening adventure, I really learned one thing, and that is that gardening ain't easy, but it's necessary. Let's get started with this video. As mentioned, as an urban prepper, I decided to focus on container gardening for year one. I thought it'd be a way of being portable. You could have them placed on a deck, which is very common for a lot of people in an urban environment. You could easily move plants next to each other for companion gardening. And you just mainly need to worry about not letting them dry out. And if you need to move someday, you could just take everything with you. After 6 months, I'd learned that gardening ain't easy. My container gardening projects had their ups and downs. Some of the vegetables that I grew did really well, like my tomatoes. Others, like my potatoes and corn, not so much. But I learned so much over this gardening season, and I'm currently regrouping so I could come back strong next year. One of the things I learned almost immediately is that gardeners are super nice and helpful. Whenever I went to a nursery, everyone seemed like they were in a very good mood, and they're always willing to provide friendly advice. Oftentimes here in the preparedness community, some of us could be a little bit grouchy because we're thinking about very serious topics. Not gardeners though. They're probably some of the nicest people that I've ever met. For companion gardening, you should check out the book Carrots Love Tomatoes. This book was recommended to me by Tori from Permaculture Homestead, who you should definitely check out. He has an awesome YouTube channel. And he told me about this book in a live stream that we had earlier this year. What I learned from this book is that vegetables are kind of cliquey. While carrots love tomatoes, tomatoes don't necessarily love potatoes or corn, but they have other friends, like parsley, garlic, and onions. This book contains a ton of data with regard to what vegetables like each other, which ones don't like each other, and how you should best distribute them in your home garden. For me, I really tried to leverage the companion gardening for my tomatoes because the tomatoes were the most important for me. They also happen to be the most cliquey of the vegetables, in my opinion. So the plants and other vegetables that I planted next to the tomatoes were specifically put there to help out my tomatoes. They had one job. There are a ton of great YouTube resources with regard to gardening if you're just starting out. Some of the ones that I enjoyed watching right off the bat were M.I. Gardener or Michigan Gardener, the lady from Garden Answer, Gary Pillarchek from The Rusted Garden, and then naturally I gravitated to a lot of the prepper channels that also do a lot of gardening. I tried to feature many of them in my gardening roundtables this year. So those prepper channels included The Provident Prepper, Prepper Potpourri, Permaculture Homestead, Ethical Preparedness, Mama Bear Preparedness, City Prepping, Rogue Preparedness, and LDS Prepper. The first thing to know about home gardening is to know your zone. This was stressed to me by Tori, again from Permaculture Homestead, who was kind of like The Rock from old school WWF of know your zone and shut your mouth. We live in Zone 8B. There are online resources available where you can check to see what zone that you happen to live in. Then you should plan out your home garden based off of what actually grows in your zone. So definitely listen to the experts on what and when to plant. Don't think that you could just come in a few months late and have it work out. I tried that with a lot of my produce, such as my potatoes, and it definitely didn't, as you'll see in this video. Again, know your zone. So in the beginning of my project, I bought a bunch of various size containers, and then I just planted the type of produce that I wanted to have in each of the containers. I figured I'd just give them some high quality dirt and water them. But plants don't just need sunlight and water, they also want to eat too. So basically they need full room and board. So I was watching one of LDS Prepper's videos on his micronutrient mix and decided to give it a shot. Link in the description box. So I picked up some of LDS Prepper's premium micronutrient mix, and then you mix it with a 25-pound all-purpose fertilizer. There's different numbers on all these fertilizers, which I slowly learned this year. You could get 10-10-10, 15-15-15, 18-18-18. All fertilizer labels have 3 bold numbers. The first number is the amount of nitrogen, the second number is the amount of phosphate, and the third number represents the amount of potassium. What, do I need to be a chemist now, like Heisenberg? The all-purpose fertilizer that I originally purchased looked like Heisenberg's blue crystal meth. While it had really great reviews, for some reason I just couldn't get past the blue color to it. I eventually replaced it with an organic fertilizer, which is brown, which was more along the color that I was expecting. I used LDS Prepper's micronutrient mix for several of my plants this year. For the most part, those seemed to work out well. You basically mixed everything together, and then I put it into a storage container and used the shot glass for distributing it out to all of my various plants. I had the best luck with companion gardening using a trick that I learned from a video from Garden Answer. In this video, she leveraged a large metal pot with some drainage holes put into it to have companion gardening for a tomato. So I went to the store and picked up one of these large metal pots, and then I took my cordless drill and drilled some drainage holes at the bottom of it. After adding dirt, I was then ready to plant my tomato. This one was a katana tomato plant. So Garden Answer recommended a few different companion plants to plant next to it. So I circled the katana tomato with some onions, peppermint, sweet Thai basil, and marigolds. I then used an organic tomato fertilizer, and that was it. Each one of those companion plants does a little something to help out the tomato, whether that be to bring in pollinators, to scare off certain type of bugs, and in general just to help out that tomato. Using this strategy, it produced pretty good yield for me, so I was really happy with it. Again, you should definitely subscribe to Garden Answer. One of the things I found myself doing was actually talking to the things that I'm growing in my garden. And I'd have full-on conversations with these plants while I'm out by myself, whether I'm watering them or kind of trimming them up. I'm just having conversations and trying to build them up, build up their self-esteem a little bit. So I found myself oftentimes talking to these plants like they're real people and having full-on conversations with them and talking about, oh, are you thirsty? Do you want some more water? Oh, here you go, little buddy. Are you hungry? Let me get you some food over here. Oh, this one looks a little troubled. Let's trim this up a little bit, and just having conversations about not only them, but about myself too. Now, most of the times my dialogues were very calming and more therapeutic for the plants. I don't know why. It was more of a stress reliever, but sometimes I had to smack talk them a little bit because plants are super frustrating, and I'd have one that was doing really well and its next door neighbor wasn't doing anything. And I'm like, hey dude, I'm giving you food, water, shelter, lodging, everything, and you're not producing. And if you're not gonna do it, I'm gonna get someone else there that will to get it done. So I found myself kind of smack talking them a little bit, but that's not the right thing to do. It could be very stressful for your plants, and you could end up with dinky little potatoes like I did. I eventually found out that there's an ugly side to plant shaming, and it needs to be stopped right away. I went to a local grocery store and they had a lot of beautiful produce, fruits and vegetables all nicely presented. And then over at the corner of this produce section, I saw a little section that said ugly produce, and it had a whole bunch of ugly produce. They're either deformed, they looked funny, they had bumps on them. It made me pretty sad to see that there was body shaming going on with produce at grocery stores where they're offering it for a ridiculously low price just because they're a little bit ugly and deformed. That's not right. We shouldn't be doing this as a society. We're better than this. So again, I cannot condone the ugly produce section of grocery stores. It's just wrong to do. These little produce are trying their best to grow. Sometimes we fail them as gardeners, and we should have just put them over on a bin and grouped them all together for some discounted price and then called them ugly. That's just not right. We can't do that in today's society. So if you work or own at a grocery store and you have an ugly produce section, shame on you. That's just the wrong thing to do for these little guys. They're trying their best to grow, and there's unrealistic standards for what a potato needs to be. We have these nice beautiful ones that have been genetically altered, and we have these little guys that are organically grown, and they're just trying their best, and it's just not right for us to publicly shame them like that at grocery stores in the produce section. So again, let's get rid of these ugly produce bags, and let's try to be mindful that these little produce's feelings do get hurt. One of the things that happened to me this year is that I felt bad eating my vegetables. This especially happened early in the season when I was growing my lettuce and spinach. I ended up looking at them as kind of like my little babies that I had raised into adulthood. And I was so proud of them, I wanted to show them off to everyone. But early on in the season, again, I felt so bad about eating them that I didn't decide to harvest them. And then they eventually died, and then everyone was making fun of me about it. So I had to learn this year that they want to be eaten. That's their whole purpose in life. But if you're like me, in the beginning, you may end up feeling a little bit guilty about eating the plants that you've grown. I think that just means that we're compassionate gardeners. While some of my vegetables were my little babies, others were sacrificial plants. For those ones, I would constantly threaten them, "You had one job to do." And that was usually protecting my tomatoes. Some of the things that I planted were just there to aid a more important vegetable like my tomatoes. For example, everyone said that I should have marigolds around my tomatoes. Well, marigolds sucked for me this year. All of them died almost instantly. I don't know what it was, but as soon as I planted them and put them next to my tomatoes, they just died. So then when people came over to the house to look at our vegetable garden, they just noticed how ugly the marigolds looked and did a little smack talking to me. But I didn't mind. One of the things that I would recommend to those that are looking at starting their first home garden is to focus on the easy plants to boost your self-esteem. So things like lettuce and spinach and zucchini and various herbs are fairly easy to grow. I planted all of those and they all grew very well, and so then I started to get a little cocky. Hey, let me try something else now. This is easy. Little did I know that gardening ain't easy. Trust me. The produce that did well for me this year were all of the herbs, so basil, dill, cilantro, my tomatoes, the cherry and the Roma. By the way, nothing tastes better than a homegrown tomato. I don't know what I've been eating all my years of my life, but the tomatoes out of my home garden tasted unbelievable. I did pretty well with zucchini and also with onions this year. And the snap peas were also a big hit. I'm going to do a lot more next season because it was really awesome just to be able to walk out to your porch and pick a couple snap peas and eat them. Now, while all of those ones did fairly well for me, there were a lot that were just a complete disaster. My number one disaster was the corn that I planted. I think I probably planted them too close to each other. I thought I had a large enough container, but I guess not. They started off really strong and they were growing really fast, which was boosting my self-esteem. But then at some point, they all just withered away and died. I'm not exactly sure what happened, but it was a disaster. One that everyone liked to tease me about, by the way. The next disaster for me this year were my potatoes. I figured if Matt Damon could grow potatoes on the surface of Mars in the movie The Martian, that I should be able to do it in my home garden. People at the nurseries were warning me that I was starting way too late in the season. But I thought, I don't really care, I'm going to just try it anyway. But they were definitely right about that because I did start pretty late in the season, and then they got a beat down in the hot sun during the summer. They looked like they were growing fairly well as far as how the leaves looked on the potatoes, but when it came down to harvesting, they were the most tiny little potatoes that you could imagine. I was used to seeing these big potatoes at the grocery store, but my potatoes were tiny marble-sized potatoes. This is another one that my entire family loved to tease me about. Next, my carrots were also fairly pathetic. Again, I was so used to the carrots that you get at the grocery store that are nice and long and straight. Mine were stumpy and curvy. I'm not sure what I did wrong on these ones. I tried planting some by the tomatoes, I tried planting some in their own container, but they all basically looked like these tiny deformed carrots. They tasted okay though. I really liked growing the jalapeno peppers, but those were also a little bit on the small side in my opinion. Again, as a city boy, I'm so used to just going to the grocery store and getting these nice size jalapeno peppers. But then when I tried growing them in my own home garden, they were just the most dinky, pathetic looking peppers that you could imagine. Again, this was another one that everyone teased me about. Radish were very easy to grow, but mine tasted terrible. They looked pretty good, and they're one of the ones that you start from seed, which is a pretty cool feeling to do. However, I planted them during the middle of summer, and I think during the hot season, it just isn't good for radishes. I like spicy, but these were way too spicy even for me. So while they looked pretty good, they were basically unedible. And then the last disaster that I had was my broccoli. The broccoli took forever to grow, and for a while I thought I was doing pretty good. Early on, the leaves were getting so beat up by various bugs. There was these little tiny worms on the bottom of the leaves that I had battles with over the year. Eventually, I just decided, hey, you could have the leaves. I don't care about the leaves. I care about the broccoli. So I let them win the battle, but I was going to win the war. Eventually, the broccoli started to grow. I was pretty excited because I was expecting to see broccoli crowns like what I could get at the grocery store. But at the end of the season, I basically had these tiny little broccoli crowns that you could basically get in one of those vegetable sample trays that you see at parties where you dip it in ranch. It was pretty frustrating because all of that work throughout the growing season was basically for a single cocktail-sized broccoli that you would just dip in ranch. I don't know what I did wrong, but I did it wrong. So as you can see, I definitely had my ups and downs, but it was an absolute blast. I'm already gearing up for next spring. This time I will be planning things out much earlier on in the year. One of the projects I've already started on is I'm converting our old kids' sandbox into a raised garden bed. This is something that came with the house when we purchased it, and it's basically been the neighborhood cat litter box. So we cleared all of that old cat litter out of it. I lined the bottom with some weed barrier and also a mesh wiring to help prevent small little critters from digging up from underneath. And we lined the interior with cedar planks. We're going to try to build up a larger cedar structure for this little garden area that'll include some walls to help protect it from the deer that also like to eat my vegetables. There's some really beautiful ones all across the neighborhood, and we're going to try to mimic some of those. The produce that I really want to get that mulligan on are the potatoes. I'm going to get it right next year. Just because Matt Damon was able to grow potatoes on the surface of Mars doesn't mean that you could grow them on Earth. But I think that I know what I did wrong, and I'm going to fix it next year. Potatoes and onions are the vegetables I really want to succeed in next year. Potatoes and onions are the ones that are recommended by Clara from Great Depression Cooking, which we had a video on earlier this year. Those vegetables in particular were used in the majority of the recipes that Clara would prepare during the Great Depression. So if all else fails, I want to make sure that I'm able to grow potatoes and onions. And last, I'm planning on being the cherry tomato king of the neighborhood. Again, I absolutely love the cherry tomatoes that I grew. I tried a few different varieties of them. The chocolate cherry tomatoes were awesome, and they were just a big hit with everyone that tried one of them. We didn't exactly make a prepared dish with the cherry tomatoes, but it seemed like every day we would just go out there, pick a handful of them, and eat them. They were the most delicious tomatoes that I've ever had in my entire life. Canning is the next step in gardening. Lately, canning supplies have been a little bit hard to come by. We've been having to get creative at going to various stores to pick up the jars, lids, and seals. But if you have a home garden and you have enough yield, you should definitely get into canning. Over the past few years, my wife has been canning all sorts of things. She's been canning jam, and pickles, and green beans, and salsa. She's really into roses and has been using the petals from the roses to make rose petal jam. We have dozens and dozens of jars of them, in addition to a whole bunch of jars of what we're calling prepper pickles. I have a video of this coming out soon with my sister-in-law who we're calling the Pickling Prepper. Stay tuned for that video. That's going to do it for this video featuring gardening ain't easy, but it's necessary. I hope that you guys enjoyed watching it. I had an absolute blast for my year 1 of gardening here at our home, and I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to year 2 of my home gardening project. Over this year 1 of my home gardening project, I really gained a whole new level of respect for gardeners and farmers. Us city folk really need the farmers to survive. Otherwise, we'd be trying to survive on these dinky little potatoes and carrots and what you saw in this particular video. There's no way I'd be able to survive in a real emergency situation with my year 1 garden. It just wasn't producing the quantities that I thought I might be able to get. I'd probably have to convert this entire backyard to a whole bunch of raised bed gardens to be able to provide enough yield for my family. While I'm probably not going to convert the entire backyard to raised beds, I am going to start doing some raised beds for year 2 of my gardening project. But I highly recommend for anyone that lives in an urban or suburban environment to try gardening, whether it be container gardening or having a raised bed garden. Can you imagine if everyone here in the United States, for example, just naturally had a large home garden in their backyard? Here in the United States, we oftentimes focus on having a nice front lawn, for example, having the greenest lawn with the best mow job on it and everything like that. And the contest between neighbors should be who has the best home garden, not who has the nicest front yard. To be honest, the grass in the front yard is more for vanity purposes. We're using up a lot of water and we're not eating our grass, so it's just for eye candy only. So I'm really looking forward to moving forward with my gardening journey and documenting it here on this channel. I was just blown away with how good everything tastes. For example, the tomatoes that I was growing were the most juicy, delicious tomatoes that I've ever had in my entire life. And it made me question, what have I been eating for all these years that I've been getting at the grocery stores? There really is something special to be able to go out to your home garden and pick some tomatoes and some snap peas and squash and be able to prepare something for your family that you've grown. I find it to have so much more flavor, and you also appreciate it a lot more than something that you were just to buy at a store. Being able to grow something from start to finish and then enjoy the fruits of your labor is really something special. So I hope that you guys enjoyed watching this video. Leave your comments below in the comment section regarding this video, and stay tuned for year 2, in which I'll be continuing my journey with home gardening. And again, gardening ain't easy, but it's necessary. See you guys next time.